So there was this Armageddon scenario, really, that most economists forecast at the time of the referendum. And yet, if we look at current economic indicators, the situation looks pretty good. The FTSE 100's been on a roll. Unemployment, is incredibly low. A survey that came out today of CFOs showed that that their confidence in business is at an 18-month high. So, what was that forecast right? What went wrong, Swati?
None of the economists that I know who are academic economists really made any kind of short-term predictions, primarily because we know those are really prone to error. So the ones that did make those predictions were really economists who were much more constrained, either because they worked for a political institution or they worked for some kind of profit-making enterprise. So in that sense, saying that somehow we got it wrong is not right. None of us made we only made long-term predictions, primarily to say that when the trade barriers come into place, then we're going to see a negative impact on trade, on investment, and therefore on economic activity and living standards. So those are the sorts of predictions we made. Those don't come into play at least till maybe 2020, 5 years down the line, or even 15 years down the line.
But there were some forecasts that were shorter term, that were kind of in the ether. Vince, is it a problem with forecasts? Vince?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think economists went around talking about Armageddon and in that kind of way. Some politicians deliberately misrepresented it. I have to say, from people in my Remain campaign behaved rather foolishly. No, I mean, what economists said, or professional economists said, is that other things being equal, you would expect to see a shock, and indeed, basic theory suggests that new news influences financial markets, and indeed it happened. The exchange rate fell by, I think, about 18% in trade-weighted terms. That's quite a big shock. Now, in terms of what's happened in the real economy, I actually worry about it, because we have had growth over the last year, quite substantial. It's almost entirely been driven by dissaving, borrowing. The figures that came out on Friday, Saturday, suggested that the British savings ratio is now at its lowest level in historical memory. So we've had a bit of a consumer boom, fueled by borrowing, by confidence in the housing market, which is always a big driver of consumer spending. But it's an old-fashioned British consumer boom. And the truth is, and I'm a bit of a minority amongst my colleagues in the coalition, but I always took the view that the British economy was fundamentally rather weak. We've had chronic underinvestment, chronic lack of innovation, chronic lack of training for many years, and when we have spurts of growth, it is usually driven by consumer borrowing and the housing market, which is very dangerous and puts us in a very bad position to deal with the very real adjustments that will now have to be undertaken when Brexit actually happens, as opposed to having a vote about it.
Andrew, so the situation looks good, but it's all been fueled by the poor British consumer who is taking on more debt and eating up their savings. Do you agree with this assessment? And if so, is it sustainable?
I think you're being a bit generous to economists here, really. 72% of economists in the Bloomberg poll immediately after the EU referendum vote predicted that there would be a recession in 2016 or 2017. So academics tend not to make so many short-term forecasts as city forecasters anyway, but in the Royal Economic Society survey of economists, 90% said that there would be a short-term loss associated with Brexit. In fact, I'd have agreed with that on the narrow question which they had there as well. Then, of course, you had the Bank of England cutting interest rates in August. It wasn't as though it was just some sort of fringe idea that there was a problem economically following the referendum. That was the mainstream view, enough to induce an interest rate cut. And it was wrong. It wasn't a stupid idea. Right, so when the Bank of England, when the Treasury had its notorious web page, front page with recession, with all the cracks and so on in the campaign, that wasn't a stupid idea. The reason that it was natural to assume that you would get a recession in the short term was that the Treasury believed that there would be something of the order of 6% loss of GDP growth by 2030. So if you were going to have a loss off in the future, you'd have expected forwards-looking consumers anticipating such a loss in their income over the medium term to bring forward to today some adjustment in their consumption path. So you'd have expected people to slow down their consumption in the short term. They didn't do it. What does that mean? It means that the economy doesn't believe it's going to be materially worse off in the medium term. Now, the economy might be wrong about that in that belief, but normally economists say that the economy's view in these kinds of matters is the best predictor of what's going to happen. It's the sort of rational expectations idea. So I think that not only are people being too generous to economists over this, but they're also refusing to learn the lesson. What they want to say is, oh, there was something bad about all the models. No, I don't think there was anything bad about the models. I think that what was wrong was their long-term prediction. And I think that what we see in the key piece of evidence that we have over the past 6 to 9 months is that the economy doesn't believe it will be worse off, materially worse off, in the long term.
Swati.
I'm going to actually counter that. I think that's not a reasonable characterization of what most economists think. Of course, one response that consumers could have would be that they reduce their consumption in anticipation of a future income loss. A second interpretation would be that, well, I start hoarding mainly because I think all that food from Europe is now potentially going to become more expensive, and you might see something there. So it's really difficult to make any kinds of short-term consequences predictions, and any kind of momentous decision like leaving the European Union for good shouldn't be made on these short-term predictions. And that's what we've been pushing for, saying that it's better to base them on what we think are much more sound predictions, sound projections of what might happen if trade barriers come into place in an environment where we're really integrated with value chains in Europe. And I think there the most sort of compelling evidence is in favor of saying that yes, in fact, there is going to be an economic loss, and it is going to potentially even hurt some of the areas which voted overwhelmingly to leave Brexit. And that's really sort of the dilemma we're in.
Well, I'm glad that you've brought us to start talking about trade, start thinking about trade deals in the future, because of course we have now invoked Article 50. We are negotiating on new arrangement with the EU. We will be free to strike new trade deals with the rest of the world. So, but Vince, did you want to come in on what Swati was saying?
Well, I mean, there are two things that we know about. I mean, lots of things we can speculate about. There are two things we can know about as it affects people's real income. I mean, one is that we have had a big devaluation, and a big devaluation has some undoubted advantage if you're a tradable activity competing against imports or exporting, and they're made more profitable. But one of the things we do know about it is, of course, it cuts people's real wages. That's what devaluations do, and that is what is now happening. And it will influence growth in the course of this year, unless there's some offsetting factor. There may be. So that's the one thing we do know about. The other is that the government is committed to leaving the single market and the customs union. It didn't need to. We could have left the European Union in a different way, but they've chosen to do that. And what it is doing as an act of conscious policy is raising trade barriers against British exporters to the European Union. It's a unique experiment in history. I can't think of any other case where governments have gone out of their way to raise trade barriers against our own producers, but they're doing it. And everything in basic economics suggests that this is going to lower our wealth relative to what it would otherwise be. I mean, it may be swamped by other factors. I know Andrew is a great believer in the entrepreneurial energies that might be unleashed in all this, but everything that we have experienced in history leads us to believe that this experiment is going to cut people's incomes relative to what they would otherwise have been.
Andrew, you wanted to come in on that.
Yes, so I wanted to point out that in the Treasury model, there was a depreciation of the pound about what we've had and a recession. So it isn't that there was one or that it's one or the other. It's not as though we've had a shock and instead of it taking the form the Treasury anticipated, instead it took the form of a devaluation. They said that there would be both. A second thing to bear in mind is the key impact you should expect from the depreciation over the next year is actually the net export gain. So when you have a depreciation of this scale in a currency, the first thing that you expect to have is that the imports get more expensive in respect of committed habits or contracts for purchasing. So your imports get more expensive and your net trade balance probably declines, but it certainly doesn't gain in the short term. Then as people adjust to the new lower prices, you expect things to do better over the medium. It's called the J-curve effect. What we've had so far has been very little net export gain. The ONS keeps telling us that they see no evidence so far of depreciation gain. So what we should expect is that over the next year we will see that coming through. One other thing that I would say is I think that it's one important and underreported thing that's happened over the past year is a very considerable increase in monetary growth. So through from the period of 2007 and to 2008 and after the financial crisis, with the banks doing very badly, you had very weak growth in the money stock. That was part of the reason we had quantitative easing and various other sorts of measures to try to get monetary growth up. I think that historians will say that Q3 2016 was when the monetary aspect of the Great Recession came to an end. Now that might be coincidence, I think it probably is, but I think that the normalization in the money growth and consequently implications for inflation going back from being a period of deflation earlier across Europe to things closer to 2% over the medium term, and probably interest rate rises will be one of the key economic features of the next few years.
Can I just go back to Andrew saying essentially that we have this export boom coming. We haven't seen it yet, but it's coming because of the weak pound. Something you've thought about?
Much to the, I don't want to be criticizing my macroeconomic colleagues, but even for the J-curve effect, if you try and look for evidence empirically, historically, there's not so much evidence out there. So I'm not sure that that necessarily, or that we should be so confident that that is going to come. But more broadly speaking, the issue is that was the devaluation just symptomatic of a loss in confidence in the UK economy, or was it something else? And whatever it be, I think an easier policy than Brexiting would be then to have an actual exchange rate devaluation if we think that that's so great for the economy, rather than doing it through this very convoluted way of getting out of a trade agreement and then expecting the currency to fall. And I don't really see why sort of we would expect an export boom now when we know that potentially tariffs on things like cars would go up by something like 10%. Somehow that devaluation has to counter those increases, and most, even the SMMT, the Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders, think that that's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to use that devaluation essentially to increase their sales.
But there won't be tariffs this year or next year.
Of course.
So
I don't think that was a debate at all.
Right.
It was a matter of long-term predictions which come into place after the trade barriers come into being.
Sure. So if you've got a depreciation whilst you don't have the trade barriers in place, and the depreciation is expecting trade barriers later, that might be the right thing for the currency to do. But in macroeconomic terms, you'd expect there to be a short-term positive boost from that.
I think this is the 6th significant devaluation since the Second World War against the dollar. And the idea that this is kind of a route to sustainable growth is, I think, rather not exactly helped by their experience. I mean, if you look back at the last 2 big devaluations, the one that followed the financial crisis didn't help us one little bit. The main reason, I think, for that was that a lot of export industries, particularly small companies, couldn't get access to credit, and there may have been very specific factors there. The one devaluation that worked, in quotation marks, was the one that occurred when Ken Clarke was the Chancellor in the mid-1990s. Undoubtedly, there was a big boost to economic growth, but the reason for that was that there was a lot of spare capacity. There was a lot of unemployment. That's not the position at the moment.
Okay. Inflation. I mean, inflation going up, wage growth not increasing at the same rate. You know, Vince has touched upon this. Surely that will have an effect on British consumers and how much they can spend.
I would expect it would. Of course, inflation coming back closer to target would normally be considered to be a good thing, right? I mean, inflation's been far away from target for some years, and now we're going to have inflation probably in the 2 to 3% range. It might be that it would go higher. If it did start to go above 3%, I think the Bank of England should be increasing interest rates to prevent it from going up. That also, of course, is one of the factors with sterling. Insofar as inflation is driven by sterling weakness, you'd expect sterling to strengthen if you raise the interest rate. So it seems to me to be entirely within the Bank of England's gift to prevent us from having excessive inflation just at the moment.
On inflation?
I think it's a very soon to say how much the inflationary impact would be, but if you were thinking sort of long-term consequences, that number is about 2% on average, and most of it seems to be, we expect that food prices would potentially increase much more unless the UK puts in place some other kind of policy. One of them could be unilateral liberalization of tariffs, because those are overwhelmingly what essentially poorer households spend on. So this could have severe inequality implications as well.
Well, I think not too many people are looking at the RPI, which we always used to use as our measure of inflation, which is significantly higher than ordinary consumer price inflation. I think at the moment RPI is 3 to 4%. And of course, the practical effect of this in ordinary human terms is that a lot of workers whose real wages have stagnated or fallen since the financial crisis are now going to be back in that position for the next couple of years or so. Whether they will just quietly accept it or whether they're going to react by being much more aggressive in bargaining, particularly in the public sector, it remains to be seen. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see a significant change in the way that a lot of those people voted Brexit. They want something out of it. They want some rewards, and actually their real incomes are going to be compressed. And I suspect there will be quite a nasty political reaction to it.
Talking about rewards, Andrew, you think that there's a gain, that there's a net gain from leaving, don't you?
Well, I think that it should be around net neutral is the way that I'd say by around 2030. So I think that we probably make some losses in the short term, and by around 2030 we should be about even. So neither much gain nor much loss. I put the estimates at between about -1% to +2% of GDP by 2030. So that's made up of some losses on our trade with the European Union, something of the order of 2%. Of GDP losses in terms of having a worse trade deal with the European Union than we have as European Union members, and then some offsetting gains. So the offsetting gains include things like the Eurozone will, I believe, grow faster now that the UK is out of the way. I think that the European Union doesn't function very well with the UK as a member, and it will be able to resolve some of its own internal issues with us gone. I think that we will be able to do new trade deals by 2030, 2/3 of our trade with the rest of the world, which we wouldn't have been able to do as EU members. So I think that we should expect to have gains from that. Obviously, we make a little bit of a gain, not very much, from repatriating our net contribution to the European Union. And then I would also expect that we'll have some improvements in the focus of our regulation in the future. Not any great bonfire, not much less regulation, but regulation that is better able to experiment. So I'll just give you one illustration of what I mean by that. When you have regulation within the European Union, much of the way the European Union works is via a ratchet process. So once something's in place, it's almost impossible to undo it. That works well if the thing you're trying to do is pretty clear. If you're trying to strip away non-tariff barriers or to remove tariffs, that's all great. If you're facing issues like what to do about the commercial exploitation of space, or the sharing economy, or the digital economy of various sorts, or new technologies like vaping, or adaptive responses to climate change, I think that when the best way to regulate is very unclear, then what you want to be able to do is to try something, get it wrong, and try again. And I think that many of the challenges that we will face in regulation over the next decade take that latter form, where it's by no means obvious what the best thing to do is, and we should gain in regulatory terms by being able to experiment, which should, I hope, allow us in some of those technologies, those new emerging technologies, to become one of the world leaders relative to the position that we'd have had as members of the European Union.
Vince, can I ask you specifically on this regulation point, as you're somebody who's obviously had first-hand experience of this? Are we likely to see this more entrepreneurial regulatory regime which is better suited for the 21st century, which is able to, you know, really get to grips with some of these new forms of economy that, and we're not going to have that legacy of regulation which maybe, you know, isn't suited for today.
Well, I think Andrew's vision is a very attractive one, and I like to think that Britain is, in many ways, a very entrepreneurial place. I'd like to make it more so. In my 5 years in the government, I was responsible for trying to get rid of red tape. We had this so-called 1 in, 2 out system, which I noticed the Trump administration has adopted. I don't know whether that's a positive or a negative. But the problem we had when we were in the coalition is that despite all the rhetoric, we actually found it quite difficult to find regulations that we could sensibly get rid of. And many of the European Union regulations that people complained about, the problem was not with the European Union regulation, it was the way that the British authorities had interpreted and gold-plated them. So it's not clear that there is some potential bonfire of regulation here. Can I just say something about these other trade deals? Because although I think actually there are potentially some upsides in Brexit, I mean, one of the ones I've advertised is the fact that we could have a more sensible takeover policy. I mean, I think one of the canards is this idea that there are these trade deals out there which are just waiting to be signed and are going to produce great benefit. I think the neat thing we need to be clear about is that our trade relationships and access to markets will deteriorate as a matter of fact, not just in the 27 countries of the European Union, but the other 30 or so countries with which Britain has a special relationship through the EU. And if you look at these countries with which we're going to sign highly productive trade agreements, I would concede that there may be 2 or 3 where this is real. The United States is one, I think, Australia and New Zealand, and the reason being that in all 3 cases, agriculture is a big issue, and we can be more liberal than the European Union. But the great fallacy is that somehow or other we can sign up to some great liberating agreements with China and India, which are potentially the 2 biggest economies in the world in the very long run. The Chinese are interested in the UK, in infrastructure investment, creative industries and so on. It's got nothing whatever to do with trade deals. They can do it anyway, and we can do it anyway. We were doing it. The Indians have already sent Theresa May packing by saying to her, look, fine, we're happy to do more trade with the UK, but the one thing we want from you are freer visas for our high-tech employees and for students. You're not willing to give them, so get on your bike and go back to the UK. It was a humiliating, embarrassing episode, and that will happen again. So the potential energy that we're going to get from these trade deals is pretty minimal, and it's confined to a handful of countries, 2 of which, Australia and New Zealand, are already locked into a Chinese-American regulatory framework and are not going to revive the empire.
I mean, I was with the Indian Minister of Trade at Davos, and I was speaking to her about the prospects for UK-Indian trade deals, and she said, oh, yes, you know, I said, is free trade deal on the table? Yes, 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 it's all on the table. If, and then the shopping list, and then I got the shopping list, and it was a long list. Now, you've thought a lot about trade. Andrew's saying that the cost of leaving the EU is going to be 2%. What was the time frame?
About 2% of GDP by 2030 in terms of the worst deal relative to the one that we had in the European Union.
Is that the sort of figure you're working with, Swati?
So we've never really had a case where a major country has left a trade agreement. So all the numbers, all the historical experience, the data will tell you that the other way around, that if you join a trade agreement, how much does your trade volume increase? And those numbers for the EU versus EFTA, even if you were an EFTA member and you went and you joined the European Union, that number is about 40% increase in trade volumes. So in that sense, 40% relative to if you had not joined. That's really the way to interpret the number. So in that sense, you know, we expect the number is not going to be 2%. It's going to be something much bigger, somewhere in the order of, broadly speaking, the central estimates are somewhere around 25%.
Sorry,
and why?
But mine was of GDP.
Oh,
GDP. You don't mean 25%.
Sure. So
GDP.
In terms of, no, of course not. In terms of sort of where your estimates and where ours are, there's a minor intersection there because we do think that, yes, GDP will decline as a result of leaving the European Union. It would be lower than what we would otherwise expect it to be on its trend. And there our numbers would go anywhere from somewhere around 2% in the best case scenario, where you essentially become like a Norway-style economy, or it would go to something like potentially even 8% if it goes to sort of cliff edge WTO default. So why is that the case? I'm going to just touch back a little bit on what both speakers said, which is that are we going to be able to make up for the loss in trade and investment from the EU and sort of go towards these other richer, bigger, faster growing countries and make up for the loss in trade and investment? It's very unlikely. From what we know from hundreds of years of data, including what happened with the Chinese opium wars, what happens sort of more broadly in a laissez-faire trade world, what we see is that countries tend to trade much more with countries that are close to them, that are rich, that are big. That's the European Union for us, just like the US for Canada. We can't somehow immediately say that we're going to replace all of that trading system and start trading a lot more with Canada, with China, India, and the US, because it's going to be about not tariffs, it's going to be about non-tariff barriers. Like, are we going to allow lawyers to come from India and start practicing here, and vice versa? Those are the kinds of issues at stake here, and it's very unlikely that even the most ambitious deal, the deal with Canada, the EU-Canada deal, does not really very fully liberalize these markets. Those annexes have hundreds and hundreds of exceptions in services trade, and that's because these are generally about regulatory cooperation. They're not about putting on a price increase onto something. That's the way things are, and we're not going to be able to change that overnight or even in the next sort of 5 to 10 years very quickly. Yes?
Just a couple of points to respond to a couple of things that were said there. So even the US deal alone, so the US is the UK's country that's the single largest trading partner. So I don't think one should think of a trade deal, new trade deal with the US as trivial. I wouldn't think that other trade deals, the other ones with China and India, wouldn't be my main targets after the US. I'd have thought that beyond the easy ones like Australia and so on, I'd have thought you'd think Japan was an economy that the EU has struggled to do a deal with and been stymied a number of times, that I think that we could realistically expect to do a deal with. On the issue of trade, who you trade with, absolutely, of course, you trade more with countries, you tend to trade more with countries that are closer to you. But on the other hand, 2/3 of our trade by 2030 will be with countries that aren't as close to us. So it's not as though I'm saying that it's not as though I'm suggesting that we're going to have some enormous increase in the volume of trade with the rest of the world that doesn't already exist. There's 2/3 of our trade. It's a question of improving the value on 2/3 of our trade. We could lose per unit of trade twice as much on the trade with the EU as we gain with the rest of the world and still come out even. So we don't even have to believe that we would get anything like as good terms with the rest of the world as the reduction, not even the level, just the reduction in our terms with the EU in order to come out about even here. So I think that one shouldn't be too pessimistic about the prospects for us gaining from trade deals with the rest of the world.
Vince, can I ask you a practical question here? You know, as somebody who's been inside, do we have the capacity to negotiate all these new trade deals?
Well, we don't, but like a good economist, let me just assume we do have one.
Well, at least you stated the assumption very clearly.
Let's assume we have good trade negotiators, and they proceed along the path that Andrew's just suggested, which is that we try to have a terrestrial trade agreement with Japan. I mean, as it happens, when I was Secretary of State, I did go to Japan in order specifically to pursue the issue about how we could put forward an agreement with the European Union. I mean, the problem which will apply to us whether we're inside or outside the European Union is that the Japanese, through the Keidan-Ren and other bodies, are very reluctant to make concessions on very specific issues around standardization and non-tariff access. And I'm completely failed to understand how a British minister negotiating on their own would have more bargaining power with the Japanese than the European Union would have. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And if we take the United States, again, let's assume the best and that we have a brilliant team of negotiators. And let's assume that Mr. Trump is actually a perfectly sensible, balanced individual who is very eager to pursue trade opening rather than trade closing, which his rhetoric suggests. A trade agreement with the United States would take several years to negotiate. It would then have to pass a Congress that would probably have a different political composition from what it does now. They have already set out 13 criteria along which to judge the success or otherwise of a bilateral agreement from the United States' point of view as opposed to ours. Number 2 on that list is whether or not your country has a bilateral surplus or deficit. Britain uniquely, amongst our trading partners, we have a trade surplus with the United States. So we're on their hit list of countries to penalise, not to reward. And you know, the practicalities of actually making these trade agreements, we haven't even got to first base, let alone whether we have the capacity.
Andrew, did you want to come in on that?
So the average US trade deal takes 18 months to negotiate, and I think that we probably managed quicker than that with the US on this occasion. And although on UK statistics, we run a surplus with the US, on US statistics, they run a surplus with us. It's the largest anomaly in international trade statistics, been in place for around a decade. The IMF had an investigation of it and they didn't really come to any conclusion as to why. And I would expect Americans to rely on good old American data, not nasty imported foreign data for this kind of question. So I think that they will assume that they run a surplus with us.
Okay, so difference of opinion in terms of how quickly we can strike these trade deals and the opportunities. Can I come back to some of the practicalities? Because obviously this isn't just, as you said, about the tariffs and how much importers and exporters are going to have to pay. But are we going to need new customs officers? Are we going to need new computer systems? How's this going to work?
So typically trade deals take deep trade deals. So I'm not talking about where you just slash tariffs, where you actually think about regulatory cooperation as well. Those take anywhere between 5 to 7 years. Even the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which didn't quite go as far in terms of non-tariff barriers as later, and NAFTA took 4 years from the date the white paper was first circulated to when it was actually implemented. So in that sense, if you're the US, yes, you can potentially do quicker deals because typically the other country accepts your template. That is not the situation we would ideally want to find ourselves in, because that would also mean a lot more intrusive behind the border policies, like what happens to investments, how do we settle those cases. Many of the same issues which had slowed down the implementation or the negotiation over TTIP are not going to go away tomorrow. Those issues are going to remain. So in that sense, I don't see how it can be done really quickly. And if it were to be done quickly, of course, it's a question of how good that deal would be, and do we have the capacity to negotiate a really good deal. Apparently, we have about 300 negotiators. I keep seeing different figures in the papers. And Germany, just to implement trade remedies, which typically figure in every kind of trade agreement so that you can enforce action if you think the other country is dumping into you, Germany has about 35,000 officers who do that. Now, we don't have that sort of capacity, which is why, Andrew is right in the sense we should be thinking of prioritizing countries, but the US is going to be a difficult negotiation. We shouldn't kid ourselves that we can do it in a year and get a really good deal out of it.
Okay, I know, Vince, I just wanted to bring the audience in because I'm sure this audience have a lot of questions and I can already see hands up.
They make a certain segment of cars, and typically the UK specializes in a different segment of cars. And it's really sort of disturbing for the car industry that if those tariffs come into place and those local content requirements come into place, what is that going to mean for using the UK as an export platform to access the single market? Which is why, and we shouldn't sort of kid ourselves that somehow the Germans are going to, want to sell cars to the UK and they're therefore going to reduce, they're going to ensure that they give us a good deal. Matthew Wisman testified in the Parliament at the Trade Select Committee, and his comment was that he's the head of the German Car Manufacturing Association. His comment was that the EU is a much more important market for us than the UK, and we're more keen on essentially keeping the EU together rather than trying to sort of get access through the UK somehow. So I think it's, how the car industry develops and what happens and what the Japanese stake would be, we're already probably seeing the worst cases of industrial policy in front of our eyes if firms are being given special deals behind the scenes.
On the perceptions.
Yeah, so, well, the car sector, of course, is a sector. We did some analysis actually for Vince's department when he was the boss there, though I don't suppose he saw it. And we suggested that the car sector was one of the sectors of the economy which had gained the most out of the single market. So you might have found that absent single market membership, cars might have been an additional 40% more expensive in the UK by today. At some of the lower end estimates, it might have been much more than that. So the importance of the car sector is quite significant within the single market. It's also the case that the car sector is one of the UK's manufacturing economy goods news stories of the past few years, much more so than I think many people appreciate. Nonetheless, you have this issue. So what will happen with the car sector? It tends internationally to be one of the manufacturing sectors that's subject to more tariffs. So something like 10% is a standard order of tariffs. For example, US cars coming to the EU pay 10%. You have around 25%, including non-tariff barriers. So I use the car sector in some of my estimates as the outer envelope of how bad things could go in terms of if we were ending up in a WTO type situation. The Germans, I think of the single market as a very important creation, and they very much value the four freedoms. So they see them as a completely one indivisible whole, free movement of goods, services, capital, and labour, and they wouldn't like to see anything threaten that. There is a sense in which, though, a single market at that level isn't quite the same thing as trade. Trading, by its nature, involves some difference. So we do things differently from you, and there's some comparative advantage from the two ways of doing things. We do things our way, we sell to you. You do things your way, you sell to us. And I think that there is a difference in the British perception about that. We don't want single market membership. It's not that we think the single market is just trade. We don't want single market membership. We want to have a trade deal, like the trade deal that Canadians and others have with the European Union. And I think that that gap in perception of exactly what we want is an important one, and that we need to be clear. What we're after is just a trade deal.
Did you want to comment on this?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there are 2 points to make. The first is that one of the things that became absolutely clear last Friday when we got the European Union guidance on negotiation is that the Germans' top priority is not their car industry, though no doubt they're conscious that there are potential losses. It is maintaining the unity of the European Union as a negotiating group. And if necessary, they will allow their car industry to take a hit, because that's not their overriding priority. The second, as far as the UK is concerned, and I was involved with the industrial strategy around the car industry for 5 years, and it is a great British success story. I mean, the real worry about it is about the customs union, because the car industry, unlike some other manufacturing industries, has very complex supply chains. You know, widgets go backwards and forwards across national frontiers several times. And if your supply chain is disrupted by the absence of a customs union, it means that every time a part goes across a boundary, you pay a tariff, or even if you find a way of negotiating that away, there has to be some inspection arrangements. And this is what terrifies the manufacturers in the UK about the potential of Brexit in the way that it is currently being negotiated. I don't know what was offered to Nissan in those early days of discussion. I notice Nissan has cooled considerably since it said it's perfectly happy to be here. The things that is worrying them stiff, actually, is how they maintain this free flow within a supply chain arrangement if you don't have a customs union. And nobody in the British government has yet answered that problem. They've merely said, you know, we can somehow negotiate a special customs union for the car industry, which is ridiculous, because that's not sustainable under international trade law.
The US administration says that a trade deal with the UK is a priority, and
Trump says a lot of things.
Yeah. Furthermore, a deal. I think that it's pretty clear, given Trump's rhetoric, why it would be a priority for the US administration. It's because they want to use it as a template of what a fair and balanced trade deal is, so as to emphasize that they're not actually against trade, they're merely against trade with Mexico and China and places which they see as having very significant differentials in the salaries of those involved and very significant differentials in terms of the environmental and other regulations, particularly in the case of China. So I think that they will see it as a priority, and I think that they will, that if we negotiate it rapidly, we should expect to get a good deal, precisely because they want to use it as a model. They will want it to be seen as good for both sides. So if we wait and we were to have a trade deal in 10 years' time, it might not be so attractive. One other thing that I would say here is that Congress has long been very keen on having a trade deal with the UK, and there won't be any problem in getting it through Congress at all. So relative to other sorts of deals which the US might find more complicated to do, a trade deal with the US will be very straightforward from that point of view as well.
How much will we gain, Swati? Have you looked into this? Were we to...
From what I remember, the numbers were mostly for the EU or US, and those numbers are small largely because they weren't really doing too much in terms of the non-tariff barriers, but I don't know how separately UK-US would go. We have tried to think about how much our estimates for the costs of Brexit would change if we also thought about putting into it the UK-US FTA, which would essentially reduce trade barriers, reduce tariff barriers, not non-tariff barriers. And there the numbers are small. It's about 0.03% of GDP is how much you end up getting extra. So these numbers were small largely because the substitution into US goods on either sides or UK goods is just not that high.
The aggregate EU figure was 0.5% of GDP for the US trade.
Well, let me just raise a practical problem, because we've already had preliminary discussions with the Americans about trade deals. It occurred in the context of TTIP, which the Trump administration has torn up. But the people in the UK who were keenest on this TTIP agreement were the British car industry, because they saw some advantage in being able to diversify their exports and build up trade in the United States with things like sports cars, which we find it very difficult to sell. But the practical problem that arose is, well, whose technical standards do you adopt, right? If you're talking about car seat safety, at the moment we have European standards because most of our trade in cars is with the European Union. It's part of the single market. So are we now going to say that because we're outside the European Union and we want a special trade deal with America, that our trading technical standards in motor vehicles are going in future to be based on American standards rather than European standards? So until you get a clear answer to that question, then you can't even begin to have a sensible discussion around non-tariff barriers. And I think any car manufacturer based in the UK would be horrified at the whole idea that they've got to completely rejig all their machine tools and production lines in order to adopt the technical standards of the United States, with which we currently do very little business.
And are they properly different, these technical standards?
Yes, they're very we have adopted European standards. You know, thousands and thousands of just very small technical points. This is what the single market's all about. And they've gradually been assimilated into British practice and regulation over a long period of time. And the Americans have a different set of regulations. And this will apply to all these so-called trade agreements. If you want to do more trade within Australia, on food products, the starting point is that many of our standards of advertising, of taste, of the stuff you put on the packets is European. And if you're dealing with Australia, which set of standards are you going to adopt? And people are sort of rushing into this, you know, wonders of these new trade agreements. They haven't even begun to think about the nitty-gritty practical problems of negotiating over non-tariff barriers, which are the essential dividing lines. Though Andrew and I disagree on the outcome, I think his presentation of gain and losses was a pretty fair-minded approach to it. And they're actually quite small compared with, as you say, you know, the big structural questions. We have chronic low productivity, we have underinvestment, British innovation as opposed to science is weak, we have an undertrained labour force. These were the things we were trying to address when we got the industrial strategy going several years ago, what I think Theresa May is now trying to recapture. That's where the real priority is. I mean, the reason where Brexit fits into all of this is that while we're trying to manage those very, very major challenges that have been around for decades and are getting worse in some ways, we've got this big structural adjustment looming up over Brexit, superimposed on top of it. And that's where I'm obviously more pessimistic than Andrew.
But Andrew, you know, all the focus on Brexit, are we focusing on the wrong thing?
These numbers, so was it between the autumn statement 2015 and the March 2016 budget? I think that the 2018 GDP level was estimated down by 1%. So if we were talking about what was going to happen by 2030, if I'm right that we're talking about numbers of the order of a couple of percent either way, I think that that's relatively small beer compared with some of the other kinds of factors that would move things around. If we were to Horlicks up the process of normalizing interest rates, for example, if we were to either wait too long and end up with inflation going high, or act too early and end up destabilizing, creating a new financial crisis, that could totally dwarf any of these other kinds of impacts in terms of the consequences for the economy. And that situation, and I think that's something which we've kept expecting to be a thing. I've kept expecting to be us to be in a situation where we start normalising interest rates for some years. It must happen in the end, and when that comes, which may well be over the next few years now, that is likely to be a more important thing than some of these other matters. Also, other kinds of questions. Well, if we were to elect Jeremy Corbyn in 2020, then you might well think that the impact of Brexit was relatively small economic beer compared with the negative consequences of that mercifully unlikely scenario.
Swati, I'm not asking you to comment on Jeremy Corbyn's election prospects and the impact.
So just one line, which is that we really are in a sort of sorry state of affairs when for decades wages have been either really low growth or almost stagnating, even hit during the financial crisis. And instead of talking about that, we're talking about self-inflicted pain by essentially leaving the single market, the customs union, and doing more economic damage in that sense.
The average US trade deal takes 18 months to negotiate, and many of them are quicker. Now, they do sometimes have a period of implementation period. It can be harder to get them through Congress and things like that over the longer term. But in this case, it'd be very straightforward, because Congress has been agitating for a deal. The Americans want to do a deal with this. And secondly, I think that they will feel the pressure to do a deal which is seen to the benefit of both sides. There'll be some sorts of issues. Who knows whether we might say, well, we don't completely ban chlorinated chicken and stuff, whether our consumers would actually buy any. It's not as though you'd be forced to buy the stuff. I don't imagine we'll buy much of that stuff. There'll be some other kinds of issues probably associated with the access of US to US pharmaceuticals firms or health service providers into the UK. There'll be some questions. I'm not saying that everything's trivial, but it seems to me that with enough will, what tends to make trade deals difficult internationally is, in the case of the EU, there's an awful lot of interest. You've got 28 sets of interests and an awful lot of ducks to get in a row in terms of making sure that you get your, you find your disparate set of gainers who don't know that they're going to gain, and the very diffuse set of gainers, consumers and so on, who can't see that they're going to gain, against a set of very concrete losers. That's one of the problems that you always have with trade deals, is this difference between the losers and the gainers. And the more complex the set of interests which you introduce, the harder it is to actually, the slower it is to get a deal. So the EU gets deals, but they get them very slowly. They don't have deals with many significant economies. With the rest of the world, the EU really, from the UK's point of view, there are only 3 of those trade deals. So people talk about all these trade deals the EU has. Look, the vast majority of them were with Andorra and San Marino and places like that. And with the, with the best will in the world, I'm sure we could struggle on for a year or 2 without an early trade deal with San Marino. The ones that count are the ones, from our point of view, the ones with Mexico, the Republic of South Africa, and Korea. So those 3 are worth having, but none of those are with a big economy other than the one with Korea. And the last thing that I would say on this, because I'm taking other people's time, I know, is that the other set of deals which tend to get complicated internationally are those where you have to get something through Congress. But in this case, Congress doesn't object. it is probably more in favour of a deal. If you look at comments by Speaker Ryan and so on, the Republicans in particular, and the Democrats aren't resistant, are more in favour of a deal even than the administration. That'll all be straightforward.
Swati, straightforward?
I just want to follow up on a couple of points there, which is that with those 28 members, yes, there comes a lot of difference of opinion, but there also comes bargaining power. If you're a big country, you generally tend to be able to get a better deal for yourself. That's just the way trade negotiations work. And in that sense, we would be losing bargaining power because we're going to essentially become much smaller and negotiating with what is the hardest country to negotiate with. And also following up on many of the same issues that arose in the trade agreements that were proposed through the EU, those aren't going to go away, and that's some point that I've already made, but just to reiterate, let me give you the same example of the EU-India deal, which Noreena was talking about. The Indian side wanted two big things. One was being able to relax migration restrictions to get Indian workers essentially to come here and work. And the second one, big one, which was a major source of contention, was that they weren't ready to cut down agricultural tariffs right away, mainly because it's a really important livelihood security issue in India. So yes, that issue went away, that the dairy farmers in India now won't end up facing the dairy farmers from Denmark, but the other issue of migration restrictions hasn't gone, and that's essentially when the Conservative Party was pretty much almost split across the line saying that are we going to give that to the Indian side or not. And I don't think that issue has gone away. And similarly, there are many other issues in the EU-US deal which are going to come up again in a UK-US deal as well.
Yes, can I just, we just had a wonderful example of the kind of breathtaking recklessness with which this whole project has been undertaken. We're dismissing the 60-odd agreements we have as San Marino and Andorra. Actually, we're talking about the whole of Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, North Africa. These are all parts of the world with which the European Union has preferential arrangements and of which Britain is part, and from which we are automatically excluded once we leave the European Union and would have to renegotiate again. You may say that's trivial, but actually I think that a lot of countries in the world would find that very difficult to understand. The other thing about the speed of agreement with the United States, it's true you could have an early agreement. Mr. Zerlich, who was their trade negotiator, was asked, how quickly we could negotiate. He said, well, we could have one tomorrow. I've got one on my desk. We'll send it to you and you sign it. And of course, the reason why serious negotiations take a long time is because of processes of bargaining. And, we are in a weaker bargaining position dealing with the United States on our own than we were as part of the European Union. Of course, they get rapid negotiations with Costa Rica because Costa Rica's got very little bargaining power. We are in a very, very difficult position. There has long been a belief, you could call it a fantasy, on part of the governing party that we can somehow or other scrap all of the systems of environmental, labour and consumer protection that we built up over a long period of time. It didn't happen more than a limited degree in the Thatcher era. It didn't happen under the coalition. Mrs. May's vision of Britain is a very different one. So I find it difficult to see quite how this suddenly lurching into what they call the Singapore model, though it isn't actually Singapore because Singapore is quite a highly regulated place, how exactly this has happened. But it does provoke an interesting question, which is that when we do leave the European Union, are we going to head in that direction or are we going to head in the opposite direction? Because part of the point about taking back control is that it will, assuming we've fully left the single market, it will enable the next British government and the British government after that to have much greater freedom to use state aids, to use competition policy, to use active intervention in the economy. And we could go one direction or the other. And it's very, very far from clear where we will go. And probably that actually is the kind of national debate that we should start to be having, rather than this endless retrospective argument about whether it was a good thing to have the referendum vote the way it did. Because there are two very different visions of the way UK could evolve, and you describe one of them, and I think we ought to be getting into that argument.
So on migration, the way I think things will probably work on migration is that the Eurozone, so immigration to the UK from the rest of the EU has been quite sensitive. After an initial boost up in levels after accession of various Eastern European states, we had it quite sensitive to relative movements in the economy of the Eurozone and the UK. So when the UK economy was doing worse than the Eurozone in 2008, 2009, net immigration fell considerably, and then once they started to go badly with the Eurozone crisis blowing up, then net immigration burst up again. The way I think things will probably work is as the Eurozone economy improves, which I expect it to do, partly because we're leaving, in fact, but just because it starts from such a low base as well, I think that the pressures on people to move in order to find jobs elsewhere in the EU will fall. So that will allow the government, with relatively limited additional controls on immigration, to take a political dividend. So what will tend to happen is that immigration from the EU would have fallen even if we'd remained. The government will introduce some limited controls on additional immigration from the European Union, and they will say, look how wonderfully it's all working, when immigration falls as it would have done anyway. And so I don't expect that you will have that much net impact on immigration over the medium term. It might be that it'll fall for 2 or 3 years to something closer to 100,000, just so they can show that they can do it. But over the medium term, I don't think there's actually much appetite in the UK to materially restrict immigration from France or Spain or Italy or Germany. I mean, we've had almost free movement with these countries for 3,000 years. We're not going to stop now.
I've always taken the view that politically there is no alternative but to try and reassure the public that immigration is being managed. And you can't sustain the present system where migration from outside the European Union is quite tightly controlled, often harshly controlled, and you have completely unrestricted migration from Poland and Romania. I mean, I just don't see politically how you can possibly sustain that. So I think it is both necessary and right that as we do leave the European Union, we have a system of managed migration, including from Eastern European countries. And I think you can do this in a way that is broadly compatible with the principle of free movement of labour by saying that people can't come here unless they have a job. A very simple step under the Swiss agreement with the European Union. They've built that in. I think we should do that. I mean, and there are a few sensible practical things. I mean, the idea that overseas students should be classified as immigrants is completely bonkers, and it is entirely the Prime Minister's personal stubbornness vis-à-vis all her colleagues, which is inflating the numbers of immigrants way beyond what they actually are in the real world. So that's a simple change we could make whether we're inside or outside the European Union.
I think it's generally really hard to calculate what the benefits of immigration are or the costs of it in that sense. I think costs are much more easy to measure because you then can ask the question that what is happening to wages or unemployment of the indigenous population. That question, I think, has been very, very well answered several times over, that even during the financial crisis, if you look at the increase in EU immigration coming, this is during the time period when accession countries were starting to send immigrants to this country. We don't see any negative effects in terms of wages. We don't see increases in unemployment, even for less skilled people in the UK who were born here. So let me put it like this. It would be very easy to say that the causality is running the other way, which is that economic growth is happening, which is why immigrants are coming here, and vice versa, saying that immigrants are coming here and therefore economic growth is going up. It's just very hard to disentangle that. So most estimates that are out there that try and make an effort to do this would come somewhere in the ballpark of 2% if we halve our immigration from the EU. But take that number with a grain of salt.
I think it's unlikely that we will have a permanent deal in respect of services, because if you were to have a goods deal, you were likely not to need individual chamber ratification across the European Union. One of the things that happened with the CETA deal with Canada was that because they'd included too much services, they then had to have all this business of Wallonians, parliaments and so on passing it. I think that the European Union will try to avoid that by having only goods in the deal, in the Brexit deal, so it can be passed quickly, and maybe have a set of bridging or transitional arrangements that apply apply to various, particularly financial services, but maybe other services, which we then review over the medium term. So it won't be a matter of having a new deal in respect of those. That's the way I'd expect the timing of that to work.
A transitional arrangement is essentially imperative because any of the services reductions in barriers is going to have to come from some sort of regulatory cooperation, which the moment we take ourselves out of the European Union, the default is going to be something like what the WTO GATS is, which is very, very limited compared to the kind of access that we have currently through the single market. So in that sense, that is going to be the crucial element here. And given that 80% of GDP comes from the services sector, that's probably the more important issue around here.